Well, this morning for the children's sermon, I brought with me a tool that I use quite frequently when I'm trying to keep myself from being distracted too much from the things going on around me. Oftentimes when I'm either reading or writing something, I like to listen to music. And so oftentimes what will happen is I'll find myself seated at my computer with these headphones on. Now these headphones are really helpful at keeping myself from being too distracted because it blocks out a lot of the noise around me. And as I think about this, I began to think about how Job probably wished he had headphones when he was sitting amongst his friends who were no help at all, comforting him in his anguish. And then I began to think, well, maybe headphones are helpful in preventing hearing too much. And maybe they're also helpful in preventing us from hearing what we need to hear. Because if I find myself sitting at my computer with my headphones on, distracted from the noise around me, I might not hear my tea kettle going off. Or I might not hear the fire alarm going off as my dinner is burning in the oven. As I began to think about that, I thought we can get really easily distracted with a lot of the stuff around us. We are so good now at creating our own self-distractions that I think we sometimes miss God trying to get our attention. Today we're going to take a look at Job. We're going to hear about him finally getting what he was hoping for, a chance to talk to God, but it ends up being a different conversation than he was hoping for. But I think had he not been so distracted by the things going on around him, he might have been able to pick up a bit more on what God was doing in those moments instead of waiting until what happened today. Let's have a word of prayer. God, we are easily distracted creatures. It doesn't take much to keep us distracted now with everything that we have available to us. But God, I pray this morning that each and every one of us takes a moment, sometime today, tomorrow, this week, to just pause, to not be distracted by what's going on around us, and be present with you. It's in your name I pray. Amen. A saint was walking by the river Ganges when he noticed some family members shouting at each other. He smiled and asked his disciples, "Why do people shout when they're angry?" The disciples paused and thought for a moment. Some said, because they lose their temper and calm. Others said they want to stress their views, and so on. Now, the saint wasn't satisfied with these answers. Finally, he explained, when two people are in love, they talked softly to each other. What happens when love increases even more? They start whispering. And then comes a point when they only have to look into each other's eyes to convey their thoughts. Now, can you guess the answer? The disciples were all the more confused. So the saint continued, when two people become angry, the distance between their hearts increases. To cover the distance, they need to shout so that they can hear each other. The more the anger, the greater the distance, and hence the more shouting. We've all witnessed it. Perhaps maybe we have even been a part of it pretty recently. For one reason or another, we've raised our voices to someone or to a group of people with whom we are talking. Perhaps if we speak louder than they do, we will convince them that we are right. The more we say, and with the greater intensity, the more likely we are to change their minds and be justified in the end. But how often have we found ourselves raising our voice, convinced of our own intelligence and wisdom, only to find ourselves shamefully embarrassed to be wrong, or painfully unable to even look at someone again? As the old saying goes, it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove any doubt. Or as Proverbs 17:28 puts it, even a fool is thought wise if he keeps silent, and discerning if he holds his tongue. It was this sort of wisdom that could have come in handy for Job and his friends gathered around him. All of them spoke plenty about their views on Job's situation, and I can only imagine them growing louder with each passing turn speaking, trying to win this argument that they were having. And throughout the story, as we heard last week, Job experiences this pain of no response to him from God. He cries out, but he can't seem to find God anywhere near him. Christian musician Andrew Peterson shares that same feeling of sorrow and pain of a distant God in his song, The Silence of God. Listen to these words that he opens the song with. It's enough to drive a man crazy. It'll break a man's faith. It's enough to make him wonder if he's ever been sane. When he's bleeding for comfort from thy staff and thy rod, and the heaven's only answer is the silence of God. Job has been crying out for comfort from the staff and rod of his good shepherd with no response. He has been demanding recourse for his suffering with no answer. All he has sensed in the midst of his pain is the silence of God. But finally, God decides to no longer allow Job and his friends to go on bickering amongst themselves and fail to see him right there among them. In a whirlwind with all sorts of noise, God shows up, and instead of answering Job's petitions directly, he demands that this human being answer the Almighty's questions first. Now, many of us probably read this part of Job with a sense of an angry, impatient God who is disgusted by Job's persistent nagging and arguing up till now. We often hear this voice of wrath speaking, bashing Job over the head time and time again with these rhetorical questions meant to cut him down to nothing. But as I've read this story more and more throughout my journey and tried to kind of put it all together in my head, I think there's a little more nuance to it than that. I don't think God is trying to crush Job to dust here, so much as he is trying to finely tune Job's mind and heart to understand the finer point of their relationship that up until this point he has kind of missed. And it's a simple and profound truth at the same time, and it is this: God is God. Job is not, and nor are any of us. It's a very simple truth that we can say. It's another thing to actually live that out in our lives. All of this for Job and for us reading Job's poor situation story here, it's a lesson in humility. Job and his friends display this pride of human arrogance by declaring absolute truths with no wisdom behind them. God even says they cloud his plans with words without knowledge. He basically calls them a bunch of dummies when he shows up. Instead of finding the humility to be silent in these moments, they all continue to try and shout above one another to get their last word in edgewise. And Job is so fixated on himself that he forgets to listen for God. Just like Job, our inability to humble ourselves creates barriers from listening to God. If we are looking at ourselves all the time, that means we are not looking upon the God of our salvation. But humility is not just for our own benefit, folks. Scientific studies recently have indicated that when we're humble, we show more generosity, more helpfulness, more gratitude in our lives. All things that can serve to draw us closer to one another and to God. Forgetting about ourselves allows us to care for others in their pain. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul praises God who comforts us to care for others in their pain. This humble approach only makes sense if God and our relationship with Him is truly seen in our lives as the greatest good we can have. Science has also revealed recently that hope is critical for human life. When we hope, we are open to the future and we find a deep sense of peace about it. But we must find time to be silenced by God's presence for those things to happen. As it turns out, Job wasn't wrong to grieve and mourn his painful situation. We cannot heal from hurts if we don't acknowledge them. But God's response here also reminds us that we are in the passenger seat in life. While the ride may be bumpy, the destination will be worth it. But being silent is one of the hardest things to do, isn't it? Especially because when we listen, we often listen for whatever our ears are most tuned to hearing. A Native American was walking down the street one day in a busy city with a businessman friend of his. Suddenly, the Native American stopped and said, "Listen." The businessman looked at him and replied, "For what?" "Don't you hear it?" "Hear what?" "Crickets." "Crickets? I don't hear any crickets." "Oh, just listen. They are so loud. Can't you hear them?" The businessman began to grow impatient at this unscheduled delay and cried, "I don't hear any crickets." The Native American looked around, and there to his right was a cricket. He quickly scooped it up and showed it to his friend. "Well, would you look at that?" the businessman gasped. "With all the noise of downtown, you could still hear it, even with us talking. I don't know how you did it." The Native American reached into his pocket and pulled out some change, throwing it on the ground nearby. A dozen people stopped and looked quickly for the change that they heard clanging on the sidewalk. He looked at his friend and said, "You will only hear that which you are tuned into hearing." Are we willing to be silent and humble ourselves to tune into what God has to say? Andrew Peterson's song that I mentioned earlier reflects on a statue of Christ that is reminiscent of his own loneliness as he neared that moment to go to the cross for us. Peterson declares in those closing words that Christ remembers all the pain and sorrow that he carried with him that was within us, even now. He knows our burdens and he wants to ease them. And so he ends this song with a gentle reminder that when we feel the pain of the silence, the aching may remain, but the breaking does not. Because God is with us and will not leave us. I want to invite us to practice some moments of silence here this morning as I close. And there's going to be a video that's going to play here in a moment. And I just want you to take in what it has to offer in the silence this morning.